When most people think of the Vatican, they picture what they are meant to see. St. Peter's Basilica rising above the square. The Sistine Chapel, carefully lit and endlessly photographed. Museums where history feels orderly, explained, and complete. But this visible Vatican is only the surface. What exists behind it is not a hidden world in the dramatic sense, but a parallel system, one that does not operate for visitors, tourists, or even most scholars. It is quieter, more fragmented, and governed by rules that have nothing to do with public curiosity. Access inside the Vatican is not hierarchical in the way modern institutions function. It is divided by purpose. Someone authorized to enter one restricted corridor may be forbidden from entering another only a few meters away. Doors do not follow logic. Hallways do not form a coherent map. This fragmentation is intentional. The Vatican is not a single archive or vault. It is a network of controlled environments, each created for a specific role: preservation, isolation, or delay. Some spaces exist to hold documents that cannot yet be released without destabilizing historical narratives. Others contain objects whose meaning remains uncertain. Some rooms exist simply to ensure that certain materials remain untouched by time, pressure, or interpretation. What defines these spaces is not secrecy as spectacle, but restraint as policy. The Vatican has existed through the fall of empires, religious schisms, revolutions, and ideological collapses. Across centuries, it learned the same lesson repeatedly: information revealed at the wrong moment can be more destructive than information withheld. So instead of forcing explanations, the Vatican preserves first. This philosophy explains why much of the inner Vatican feels unresolved. Not unfinished, but deliberately incomplete. There are rooms where nothing is displayed, only stored. Corridors that lead to sealed doors without labels. Archives that record events without commentary. The Vatican does not always attempt to answer history's questions. In many cases, it chooses to hold those questions intact. From the Vatican's perspective, history is not a puzzle to be solved quickly. It is a responsibility to be carried across generations. To explain too soon is to risk distortion. To destroy is to erase evidence forever. Preservation offers a third path. This is why the hidden Vatican does not feel like a place waiting to reveal a single shocking truth. It feels like a system built around time, slowed, layered, and suspended. What lies beyond the public Vatican is not one secret, but a method. A method that prioritizes continuity over clarity. Memory over immediacy. Patience over disclosure. Because once something is preserved, it can wait. And in the Vatican, waiting is not neglect. It is intention. At the core of the Vatican's hidden system lies the Vatican Apostolic Archive, one of the most extensive repositories of recorded history in existence. For centuries, it was commonly referred to as the secret archive, a term that fueled endless speculation. In its original meaning, however, the word secretum did not imply mystery or conspiracy. It meant private. Private to the Pope. Private to the institution tasked with safeguarding continuity across time. The physical scale of the archive is difficult to comprehend. Shelves extend for tens of kilometers, holding documents that span more than 1,000 years. Papal correspondence, diplomatic negotiations, internal theological debates, trial transcripts, royal petitions, and reports from distant regions once at the edge of the known world. Many of these documents are accessible to approved researchers. Others are restricted by date. Some remain sealed for generations. The reasons are rarely explained publicly. Certain files involve political agreements whose consequences still shape modern borders and institutions. Others contain testimonies that directly contradict official historical narratives. Some present multiple versions of the same event, recorded by different observers, none identified as authoritative. What makes the Vatican Apostolic Archive unique is not what it hides, but how it records. It does not attempt to resolve contradictions. It does not harmonize competing accounts. It does not correct history to make it coherent. Instead, it preserves events as they were documented, confusion included. In many cases, correspondence ends abruptly. Investigations stop without conclusion. Decisions are recorded without justification. There is no editorial voice explaining which version should be believed. The archive is not designed to tell a story. It is designed to hold memory. From the Vatican's perspective, history is not a clean narrative unfolding toward clarity. It is a layered accumulation of perspectives shaped by belief, power, fear, and uncertainty. This is why so many documents remain sealed. Not because they are forbidden, but because they cannot stand alone without sufficient context. Released too early, they invite interpretation without understanding. Archivists within the Vatican do not see themselves as arbiters of truth. They see themselves as custodians of record. Their responsibility is not to interpret the past for the present, but to ensure that the past survives intact for the future, including its silences. Within the archive, contradictions are not mistakes. They are evidence. And in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, evidence is preserved not to settle history, but to allow history to remain open. Open to time. Open to re-evaluation. Open to a future that may understand what the present cannot. Beyond documents and written records, the Vatican preserves something far more difficult to explain: physical objects whose meaning remains unresolved. These spaces do not resemble museums. There are no glass displays, no lighting designed for visitors, no explanatory labels. Instead, there are storage rooms, controlled environments, and chambers built for one purpose only: preservation without interpretation. Many of these objects entered Vatican custody gradually, over centuries. Some arrived through early missionary expeditions, brought back from regions where Christianity encountered belief systems far older than itself. Others were transferred quietly from monasteries that were later closed, dissolved, or abandoned. Some were removed from archaeological excavations beneath ancient churches, where layers of history overlap in ways that resist simple explanation. What unites these objects is not their appearance, but their classification. In internal inventories, Vatican archivists often describe what an object is not, rather than what it is. Not liturgical. Not decorative. Not canonical. This method of documentation is revealing. When an object does not fit within an existing religious, cultural, or historical framework, it is not discarded. It is stored. Preservation takes precedence over explanation. Some items are fragments. Parts of structures whose originals no longer exist, or whose purpose was never recorded. Others are complete objects made with clear craftsmanship, yet offering no obvious function. Their materials are familiar, but their form does not align with known traditions. In several documented cases, objects were examined briefly, then removed from public circulation. Not because they were declared dangerous, but because no responsible interpretation could be offered at the time. This approach extends even to human remains. Within restricted areas are preserved remains that were never associated with veneration, never placed on display, and never integrated into official narratives. These were not destroyed. They were isolated, minimally documented, and stored under carefully controlled conditions. Once again, the priority was not denial, but restraint. The Vatican's philosophy toward such objects is consistent. It does not force meaning where meaning cannot yet be supported. It treats uncertainty as a condition of responsible preservation. From the Vatican's perspective, premature explanation can cause lasting distortion. An object explained incorrectly becomes misinformation. An object preserved quietly remains evidence. This is why many of these collections feel suspended in time. They are neither forgotten nor resolved. They exist in a state of waiting. Waiting for new methods of analysis. Waiting for new historical context. Waiting for a moment when interpretation would clarify rather than confuse. The Vatican does not treat these objects as threats. It treats them as unanswered questions. And within its restricted rooms, unanswered questions are not failures of knowledge. They are obligations, carried forward, intact, until understanding becomes possible. Some of the most carefully regulated spaces within the Vatican are not archives in the conventional sense. They are sealed rooms, environments created not for study or display, but for containment. These rooms do not appear in public guides or exhibition plans. Their locations are known only to a small number of custodians, and access is granted rarely, often temporarily, and always under strict supervision. Inside them are not shelves meant for reading, but containers designed for stability. Stone chests reinforced with metal bands. Heavy wooden cases wrapped and rewrapped across generations. Metal boxes sealed with mechanisms that record any disturbance. In several internal inventories, the condition of a seal is described in greater detail than the contents themselves. An intact seal is routine. A broken seal is documented as an incident. A replaced seal is recorded precisely, with dates and witnesses. This emphasis reveals a fundamental priority. What matters most is not interpretation, but control. The Vatican has long understood that knowledge carries consequences beyond curiosity. Some information challenges belief systems. Some destabilizes institutions. Some raises questions that cannot be responsibly answered within the intellectual or cultural framework of the present. Rather than destroy such material, the Vatican isolates it. This approach is often misunderstood as secrecy or suppression. In reality, it reflects an institutional philosophy shaped by centuries of survival. The Vatican does not view itself as the final interpreter of meaning. It views itself as a caretaker of continuity. Certain materials are preserved in silence because silence protects them from misuse. Without context, explanation becomes speculation. Speculation becomes distortion. So containment becomes a form of responsibility. This logic extends beyond individual objects. Entire rooms function as pauses in history, places where interpretation has been deliberately postponed. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It is restraint. The Vatican's experience has taught it that releasing information prematurely can fracture belief and identity. Waiting allows meaning to mature alongside understanding. As a result, within the Vatican exist materials that are neither denied nor affirmed, neither explained nor erased. They remain unresolved by design. From the Vatican's perspective, the greatest risk is not controversy. It is forgetting. To forget is to lose evidence permanently. To preserve, even in silence, is to allow the future a chance to understand what the present cannot. This is why the sealed rooms feel less like vaults of forbidden knowledge and more like instruments of time. They slow history down. They protect it from haste. The Vatican does not promise revelation. It promises preservation. And in its sealed spaces, history is not hidden. It is held. To understand the Vatican's approach to secrecy, one must first understand how it views time. Most modern institutions operate on urgency. Information is expected to be released quickly, explained immediately, and debated publicly. Transparency is treated as a moral obligation, and delay is often interpreted as deception. The Vatican does not share this perspective. As an institution that has existed for nearly 2,000 years, it does not measure responsibility in decades, but in centuries. Decisions are made with an awareness that today's clarity can become tomorrow's distortion. From this point of view, truth is not only about accuracy. It is about timing. A document can be authentic and still be dangerous if released without the intellectual, cultural, or historical framework necessary to understand it. An artifact can be real and still destabilizing if it invites conclusions that cannot be responsibly supported. This is why the Vatican often chooses delay over disclosure. Waiting is not avoidance. It is a form of control over interpretation. By postponing explanation, the Vatican limits speculation. It reduces the risk of narratives forming before sufficient context exists. It prevents isolated facts from being absorbed into ideologies, conspiracies, or political agendas. This approach may feel frustrating to the modern world, which values immediacy. But from the Vatican's perspective, immediacy is a liability. History has repeatedly shown that once information enters the public sphere, it cannot be contained. It is reshaped, simplified, weaponized, and often detached from its original meaning. The Vatican has witnessed this process countless times. Doctrinal debates that fractured communities. Documents taken out of context and used to justify violence. Discoveries interpreted through the lens of fear rather than understanding. Each episode reinforced the same lesson: releasing information without preparation does not lead to truth. It leads to chaos. So the Vatican acts as a buffer between knowledge and reaction. This does not mean that truth is denied. It means that truth is paced. Some materials are scheduled for future release. Others remain sealed until complementary records become available. Some may wait indefinitely, not because they are false, but because they cannot yet be placed within a coherent historical framework. In this system, silence becomes an ethical choice. The Vatican does not see itself as withholding truth from the world. It sees itself as protecting truth from being misunderstood. This is why time, not revelation, is its primary tool. By stretching interpretation across generations, the Vatican ensures that when something is finally revealed, it is met with understanding rather than shock. From the outside, this approach can appear secretive. From within, it is seen as custodianship. Because for an institution tasked with preserving human memory, the greatest failure is not delayed explanation. It is irreversible misunderstanding. And in the Vatican's philosophy, time is the only force capable of preventing that. To understand why the Vatican preserves so much in silence, it is necessary to understand how it defines its role in history. The Vatican does not see itself primarily as a source of answers. It sees itself as a custodian of memory. This distinction is crucial. Modern institutions often define success through explanation, publication, and accessibility. Knowledge is expected to circulate, to be clarified, to be consumed. The Vatican operates according to a different logic. One shaped by continuity rather than immediacy. For the Vatican, memory is not something to be optimized. It is something to be protected. Over centuries, the institution learned that memory can be fragile. Documents burn. Objects decay. Narratives collapse when political systems fall. What survives is often not what is most accurate, but what is most convenient. The Vatican's response to this reality was not to compete in interpretation, but to preserve evidence. Its archives, sealed rooms, and restricted collections exist as a counterweight to historical loss. They are designed to ensure that even when societies rewrite their past, traces of earlier versions remain intact. This is why the Vatican tolerates contradiction within its holdings. Two documents may describe the same event in incompatible ways. An artifact may challenge a dominant historical narrative. A testimony may raise questions that were never answered. Rather than resolving these tensions, the Vatican stores them. From its perspective, history is not a verdict. It is a record of how people understood their world at different moments in time. To erase contradiction would be to falsify memory. This custodial mindset also explains why the Vatican is willing to preserve material that reflects poorly on its own history. Records of internal conflict, failed decisions, moral uncertainty, and institutional error are not systematically removed. They are archived. Not to invite criticism, but to prevent amnesia. The Vatican understands that institutions survive not by appearing flawless, but by maintaining continuity with their own past. Even an uncomfortable past is preferable to an invented one. This approach places the Vatican in a unique position among global institutions. It functions less like a government and more like a long-term memory bank, one that outlives regimes, ideologies, and cultural frameworks. In this system, the Vatican's silence is not passive. It is active stewardship. By choosing not to interpret everything immediately, it allows future generations to encounter historical material without being constrained by the assumptions of the present. What seems obvious today may appear naive tomorrow. What feels shocking now may later become contextualized. The Vatican plans for that distance. This is why it resists the pressure to explain itself constantly. It is not trying to control belief. It is trying to ensure that belief, doubt, and reinterpretation all remain possible in the future. To the Vatican, memory is not about certainty. It is about preservation. And preservation, by definition, requires patience. Within the Vatican's vast archival system, some of the most unsettling materials are not those that contain dramatic claims or controversial statements. They are the documents that simply stop. Letters that end mid-sentence. Investigations that conclude without verdicts. Reports that reference evidence which is never attached. These abrupt endings are not rare anomalies. They appear across centuries, languages, and categories of record. From the outside, such gaps invite suspicion. From within the Vatican's archival logic, they represent something else entirely. They are moments where history itself failed to reach resolution. In many cases, the reason is mundane. A witness died. A political situation changed. A superior authority intervened. A conflict was no longer relevant to those in power. But the Vatican did not retroactively complete these stories. It preserved them exactly as they were left. This decision reflects a deliberate philosophy. The archive does not exist to provide closure. It exists to preserve process. A modern institution might summarize unfinished investigations, add commentary, or contextualize missing conclusions. The Vatican resists this impulse. To explain an unfinished document would be to invent an ending. Instead, the archive allows incompleteness to remain visible. This creates an uncomfortable reality. Within the Vatican's collections are records that point toward answers that were never reached. Accusations that were never resolved. Questions that were never formally closed. These silences are not editorial choices. They are historical facts. In some cases, archivists recorded marginal notes indicating that a matter was suspended or set aside. Rarely is a reason given. The document simply transitions from active inquiry to archival memory. This practice challenges modern expectations of transparency. We are accustomed to believing that every question must have an answer, every investigation a conclusion. The Vatican's archives suggest otherwise. They reveal that history often unfolds without resolution. By preserving these unfinished records, the Vatican acknowledges a fundamental truth: power, belief, and circumstance frequently interrupt the pursuit of certainty. Rather than conceal this reality, the archive exposes it through absence. An ending that never came becomes part of the record. For historians, these documents are both frustrating and invaluable. They demonstrate how decisions were deferred, how responsibility shifted, and how authority sometimes chose silence over conclusion. More importantly, they prevent later generations from imagining coherence where none existed. The Vatican could have closed these gaps. It could have standardized outcomes. It chose not to. Because to do so would erase the uncertainty that defined those moments. In this way, the archive does not merely preserve information. It preserves hesitation. It preserves the point at which history paused, not because the truth was known, but because it could not be reached. And in those pauses, the Vatican allows future generations to confront the limits of knowledge itself. Not everything that was asked was answered. Not everything that was begun was finished. The archive records that reality without correction. And sometimes, the most honest historical record is the one that admits where understanding stopped. One of the most challenging aspects of the Vatican's archives is not what they conceal, but what they openly preserve side by side. Conflicting versions of the same event. In many archival collections, multiple accounts describe identical moments in history, the same council, the same trial, the same political negotiation, yet they do not agree. Dates shift. Motives change. Outcomes are framed differently depending on the observer. Modern historical institutions often attempt to reconcile such discrepancies. They select a dominant narrative and relegate alternatives to footnotes. The Vatican does not. Instead, it preserves contradictions without resolution. Within the Apostolic Archive, it is not unusual to find parallel documents that directly oppose one another. A report may describe an event as orderly and justified, while another, written days later, frames it as chaotic and morally troubling. Neither is marked as false. Neither is corrected. They coexist. This approach reflects a fundamental assumption: history is not experienced uniformly. It is perceived through position, belief, fear, and authority. By preserving multiple perspectives, the Vatican acknowledges that truth is often fragmented across viewpoints rather than contained within a single account. This can be unsettling for modern readers. We are trained to seek clarity, to identify which version is correct. The Vatican's archives resist that instinct. They suggest that accuracy is sometimes distributed, not centralized. In several cases, contradictions appear not because witnesses disagreed, but because reality itself shifted rapidly. Political alliances changed. Doctrinal positions evolved. What was considered acceptable on one day became controversial on the next. Rather than retroactively harmonizing these changes, the Vatican records them as they happened. This creates an archival landscape where certainty is rare, and context is everything. A document written under one pope may contradict another written under his successor. Both are preserved. Neither is privileged. From the Vatican's perspective, to eliminate contradiction would be to falsify memory. It would impose coherence where none existed. This philosophy extends beyond theology into diplomacy, law, and governance. Treaties are recorded alongside objections. Decisions alongside dissent. The result is an archive that reflects the instability of human institutions rather than an idealized version of them. For historians, this presents a challenge. The Vatican does not tell researchers what to think. It presents evidence and leaves interpretation open. This openness is deliberate. By refusing to resolve contradictions prematurely, the Vatican ensures that future generations can reinterpret events with new tools, new perspectives, and new questions. What appears contradictory today may become comprehensible tomorrow. What seems irreconcilable now may later be understood as the product of its time. In this way, the Vatican's archives do not enforce a single truth. They preserve the conditions under which truth was contested. And by doing so, they remind us that history is not a fixed account of what happened. It is a record of how people understood what was happening, often differently, and often simultaneously. Among the most misunderstood practices of the Vatican is the long-term sealing of certain files, not for years, but for generations. To the modern mind, this feels excessive. Why would information need to wait 100 years? 200? More? The answer lies in how the Vatican defines responsibility. A document is not sealed simply because it is controversial. Many controversial materials are openly accessible. What leads to long-term restriction is context, or the lack of it. Some records describe events whose consequences are still unfolding. Others involve institutions, families, or regions that continue to exist. Some contain accusations that were never resolved, testimonies that were never corroborated, or decisions made under extraordinary pressure. Releasing such material too early does not clarify history. It distorts it. The Vatican has learned that information, when separated from its full context, invites speculation rather than understanding. Once a narrative forms in the public imagination, it becomes nearly impossible to correct, even when new evidence emerges. Sealing a file is therefore not an attempt to hide truth. It is an attempt to protect it from premature interpretation. In many cases, files are sealed until all involved parties are no longer living. This removes the possibility of retaliation, misrepresentation, or political exploitation. In others, files remain closed until related documents from multiple periods can be released together. The Vatican does not want isolated facts to speak alone. It wants them to speak in chorus. This long-term perspective is rare in modern institutions, which operate under constant pressure for disclosure. The Vatican, by contrast, plans across centuries. It asks not, what will this reveal today? But, how will this be understood tomorrow? There is also an ethical dimension. Some documents involve private confessions, internal deliberations, or decisions made in moments of crisis. To expose them without the ability to explain their full circumstances would be to violate the very people whose lives they record. Silence, in such cases, becomes an act of protection. This approach frustrates journalists and historians alike. It appears obstructive. But from the Vatican's perspective, it is consistent. History is not harmed by waiting. It is harmed by being misunderstood. By sealing certain files for centuries, the Vatican ensures that when they are eventually opened, they enter a world capable of reading them with distance rather than emotion. Distance allows nuance. Distance allows restraint. And restraint, for an institution built on memory rather than immediacy, is not a weakness. It is a discipline. To fully understand how the Vatican manages knowledge, one must recognize one central principle. Time is not a background factor. It is the primary instrument. Most institutions treat time as an obstacle. Information ages quickly, relevance fades, urgency dominates decision-making. The Vatican operates in the opposite direction. It uses time deliberately, shaping how knowledge is absorbed, interpreted, and remembered. In this system, delay is not passive. It is strategic. The Vatican understands that meaning changes with distance. An event interpreted immediately is filtered through emotion, fear, loyalty, or political pressure. The same event, revisited generations later, is viewed with detachment and broader context. Time removes urgency. It weakens bias. It reduces the need for defense. This is why the Vatican often postpones explanation rather than suppressing material outright. By allowing decades or centuries to pass, it ensures that future readers encounter documents without the emotional weight carried by those who lived through the events. What was once scandal becomes case study. What was once heresy becomes historical debate. What was once dangerous becomes instructive. This approach is visible across Vatican policy. Documents are grouped by era, not theme. Objects are preserved until technological advances allow safer analysis. Testimonies are held until corroborating material emerges. Nothing is rushed toward resolution. From the Vatican's perspective, haste is the enemy of understanding. When information is released too quickly, it is interpreted through the lens of the present, a lens that is always temporary. Time, by contrast, creates intellectual neutrality. This long view also protects the institution itself. The Vatican has learned that immediate transparency can provoke reaction without comprehension. Reaction leads to polarization. Polarization hardens narratives before evidence is fully available. By slowing the flow of information, the Vatican limits the formation of irreversible conclusions. This does not mean it avoids accountability. It means it postpones judgment until judgment can be informed rather than impulsive. The modern world often confuses delay with deception. The Vatican does not. It sees delay as a form of responsibility. In its logic, knowledge is not a product to be consumed. It is a burden to be carried carefully. Time allows that burden to be distributed. Generations change. Cultural assumptions shift. Methods of analysis improve. What could not be understood before becomes interpretable later. The Vatican plans for that future reader. Someone who is not invested in defending or attacking the past, but capable of examining it. This is why time is woven into every aspect of Vatican preservation. It is not an external condition. It is a tool. A tool that shapes how truth survives. Because from the Vatican's perspective, the greatest threat to knowledge is not silence. It is immediacy. Not all objects preserved by the Vatican arrived through donation, diplomacy, or inheritance. Some were uncovered. Beneath churches, basilicas, and ancient foundations across Rome and beyond, excavations have been conducted for centuries. Layers of history overlap in these places, pagan structures beneath Christian ones, older shrines beneath newer sanctuaries. Most discoveries follow a familiar path. They are documented, catalogued, sometimes displayed. But a small number do not. These artifacts are removed quietly, without public announcement, and transferred directly into restricted custody. They never appear in museum inventories. They are not photographed for exhibitions. Their existence is acknowledged only in internal records. What distinguishes these objects is not their appearance, but their context. Some were found in locations where no such items were expected to exist. Others were discovered embedded within foundations, walls, or sealed spaces that predated the structures above them. Some were associated with ritual layers that could not be easily classified as Christian, pagan, or transitional. In these cases, interpretation becomes dangerous. To explain such an object incorrectly would rewrite history. To display it without explanation would invite speculation. So the Vatican removes it from view. Internal excavation reports often describe these items with extreme caution. Measurements, materials, and location are recorded precisely. Interpretation is minimal or entirely absent. In several cases, notes indicate that an artifact was examined briefly, then transferred for preservation, with no further commentary. This does not imply fear. It implies restraint. The Vatican understands that archaeological context is as important as the object itself. When context is incomplete, meaning becomes unstable. An artifact without reliable context can be used to support almost any narrative. Religious, political, ideological. By withholding such objects from public interpretation, the Vatican prevents them from becoming tools of distortion. Some of these artifacts remain in storage for decades. Others for centuries. They are revisited periodically as methods of analysis improve or as new discoveries provide additional context. Until then, they wait. This approach frustrates those who expect immediate answers from archaeology. But the Vatican does not see archaeology as a source of spectacle. It sees it as a responsibility. Every object removed from an excavation carries the weight of historical consequence. Once displayed, it shapes understanding permanently. The Vatican prefers delay over error. Because in its philosophy, a mistaken explanation does more damage than an unanswered question. By preserving artifacts without interpretation, the Vatican allows history to remain open rather than forcing it into a premature conclusion. These objects are not hidden because they are shocking. They are withheld because they are unresolved. And within the Vatican system, unresolved history is not something to be rushed. It is something to be protected. Until understanding catches up. Among the most intriguing materials preserved by the Vatican are objects that were examined carefully, sometimes extensively, and then quietly removed from active study. These items were not ignored. They were not forgotten. They were, in many cases, documented in detail. And then, they were set aside. Internal records show moments of focused attention, expert consultations, measurements, sketches, comparative notes. In some instances, multiple specialists were involved across different disciplines. The object was treated seriously. But after this initial phase, something changed. The trail ends. There are no follow-up reports. No published conclusions. No evidence of continued analysis. The object remains preserved, but no longer pursued. This pattern raises an important question: why would an institution committed to preservation and scholarship stop short of explanation after investing effort in study? The answer lies in the difference between investigation and interpretation. An object can be studied without being explained. Measurements can be taken. Materials can be identified. Comparisons can be made. But interpretation requires context, cultural, historical, symbolic, and in some cases, that context simply does not exist. When an object resists placement within known frameworks, continued analysis risks producing conclusions driven more by assumption than evidence. At that point, further study does not clarify. It distorts. The Vatican is acutely aware of this danger. To declare an explanation prematurely would fix meaning where meaning remains uncertain. Once a narrative is published, it becomes difficult to reverse, even if later evidence contradicts it. So instead of forcing closure, the Vatican stops. This does not mean the object is dismissed. It is preserved carefully, catalogued thoroughly, and revisited only when new tools or comparative material become available. Silence, in this context, is methodological. Some of these objects reappear decades later, examined under new technologies or alongside newly discovered artifacts. Others remain untouched, waiting for a future that may provide the missing context. The decision to pause study is not made lightly. It reflects an understanding that knowledge advances unevenly. Not all questions can be answered with the tools of the present. In modern research culture, unanswered questions are often seen as failures. The Vatican rejects this view. It treats uncertainty as a legitimate outcome. By allowing an object to remain unexplained, the Vatican preserves the possibility of future understanding rather than locking it into a flawed interpretation. This approach challenges expectations. It asks historians and observers to accept that not knowing is sometimes the most responsible position. The objects studied once and then set aside occupy a unique status. They are not mysteries in search of solutions. They are reminders of the limits of interpretation. They exist as evidence without explanation. And in the Vatican's philosophy, that is not a weakness. It is an acknowledgement of intellectual honesty. Because history does not always reveal itself on command. Sometimes, it requires patience. Within the Vatican's restricted collections exists a distinct category of material that occupies an uncomfortable middle ground between knowledge and restraint. These are objects that were formally examined, officially acknowledged, and carefully documented, and then deliberately removed from active discussion. They were not rumors. They were not accidents. They were not overlooked. In archival records, these objects appear with precise descriptions. Dimensions, materials, condition, and location of discovery. In some cases, they are accompanied by sketches, early photographs, or comparative notes linking them to other known artifacts. The Vatican took them seriously. And then, the process stopped. There are no public conclusions. No final assessments. No theological or historical placement. The object remains preserved, but its interpretation is suspended. This silence is not arbitrary. It reflects a moment when investigation reached the edge of reliable context. An object can be analyzed physically, but meaning cannot be assigned without a framework. When no framework exists, or when all available frameworks produce contradictions, interpretation becomes speculative. The Vatican does not speculate. To publish an explanation that cannot be supported would be to introduce distortion into the historical record. Once published, that distortion is nearly impossible to undo. So the institution chooses a different path. It preserves the object exactly as it is and removes it from narrative circulation. This decision often follows a clear internal signal. Continued interpretation would say more about the assumptions of the present than about the reality of the past. Some of these objects challenge established timelines. Others resist classification into known religious categories. Some appear functional, but their function does not align with documented practices of the era in which they were found. Rather than forcing these anomalies into existing systems, the Vatican allows them to remain anomalies. This creates a form of institutional humility. The Vatican acknowledges that there are limits to interpretation, limits to knowledge, and limits to responsible explanation. Not every question can be answered honestly with the tools available at the moment. This approach contrasts sharply with modern expectations, where every discovery is expected to produce a conclusion. The Vatican rejects this pressure. In its philosophy, an unresolved object is not a failure of scholarship. It is an honest reflection of historical complexity. Some of these items may be re-examined in the future, when new discoveries or analytical methods provide missing context. Others may never be revisited. The Vatican accepts both outcomes, because its priority is not explanation for its own sake. It is preservation without distortion. By choosing silence after examination, the Vatican protects the integrity of the historical record, even when that record remains incomplete. And in doing so, it reminds us that the most responsible answer to some discoveries is not interpretation, but restraint. Among the most sensitive materials preserved within the Vatican's restricted spaces are human remains that exist without clear identity. These are not relics prepared for veneration. They are not saints' bones displayed behind glass. They are not part of any public devotional tradition. They are remains that do not fit. In several internal records, such remains are listed with minimal description, location of discovery, condition, approximate dating. Names are absent. Attribution is avoided. In some cases, even cultural classification is uncertain. What makes these remains unusual is not simply their anonymity. It is the absence of narrative around them. Most historical institutions attempt to assign identity wherever possible. They connect remains to known individuals, communities, or practices. The Vatican does not always do this. When attribution cannot be made responsibly, it is withheld. Some remains were discovered beneath churches during restoration work. Others were found in sealed burial contexts that did not align with known Christian or pre-Christian practices. A few were uncovered in locations where no burial was expected at all. In such cases, explanation becomes risky. To assign identity without evidence would be to invent history. To display remains without context would invite sensationalism. To destroy them would erase data permanently. So the Vatican preserves them quietly. These remains are stored under controlled conditions, documented only as much as evidence allows. They are not integrated into theological narratives. They are not used to support claims or doctrines. They exist as biological facts without symbolic meaning. This approach reflects a profound restraint. Human remains carry emotional, cultural, and religious weight. Mishandling them can provoke outrage, misunderstanding, or exploitation. The Vatican chooses caution. It treats these remains not as proof of anything, but as unresolved evidence. Evidence that may one day be contextualized, or may remain forever ambiguous. Modern forensic methods have made it possible to extract more information from remains than ever before. Yet even with these tools, identity is not guaranteed. Data can suggest possibilities, not certainty. The Vatican is acutely aware of this limitation. Rather than presenting partial conclusions as truth, it accepts uncertainty as the most honest position. In doing so, it resists a powerful temptation, the desire to turn human remains into stories. Stories attract attention. Silence preserves dignity. By refusing to speculate publicly about unidentified remains, the Vatican avoids transforming individuals into symbols they may never have been. This practice often frustrates outsiders who seek revelation. But from the Vatican's perspective, restraint is an ethical obligation. Because once identity is assigned publicly, it cannot be withdrawn. These remains exist in a state of careful suspension, preserved, respected, and unresolved. They remind us that not all history can be named. And that sometimes, the most responsible way to remember the dead is to acknowledge what we do not know about them. These remains are stored under controlled conditions, documented only as much as evidence allows. They are not integrated into theological narratives. They are not used to support claims or doctrines. They exist as biological facts without symbolic meaning. This approach reflects a profound restraint. Human remains carry emotional, cultural, and religious weight. Mishandling them can provoke outrage, misunderstanding, or exploitation. The Vatican chooses caution. It treats these remains not as proof of anything, but as unresolved evidence. Evidence that may one day be contextualized, or may remain forever ambiguous. Modern forensic methods have made it possible to extract more information from remains than ever before. Yet even with these tools, identity is not guaranteed. Data can suggest possibilities, not certainty. The Vatican is acutely aware of this limitation. Rather than presenting partial conclusions as truth, it accepts uncertainty as the most honest position. In doing so, it resists a powerful temptation, the desire to turn human remains into stories. Stories attract attention. Silence preserves dignity. By refusing to speculate publicly about unidentified remains, the Vatican avoids transforming individuals into symbols they may never have been. This practice often frustrates outsiders who seek revelation. But from the Vatican's perspective, restraint is an ethical obligation. Because once identity is assigned publicly, it cannot be withdrawn. These remains exist in a state of careful suspension, preserved, respected, and unresolved. They remind us that not all history can be named. And that sometimes, the most responsible way to remember the dead is to acknowledge what we do not know about them. In most museums, discovery leads to display. An object is found, studied, interpreted, and eventually presented to the public. The Vatican does not follow this sequence. Within its collections exist materials that were never intended for exhibition, and never will be. This decision is not based on fear of reaction, nor on a desire to conceal information. It is based on the recognition that display itself is a powerful form of interpretation. Once an object is placed behind glass, it stops being neutral. It becomes framed, explained, assigned meaning. For many discoveries held by the Vatican, this step would be premature. Some objects resist classification so completely that any attempt to display them would force an artificial narrative. A label would have to be written. A category chosen. A historical function suggested. And once suggested, that interpretation would harden into perceived fact. The Vatican understands that exhibition creates authority. What is shown appears validated. What is labeled appears understood. In cases where understanding is incomplete, the Vatican chooses absence over misrepresentation. This applies especially to objects recovered from ambiguous contexts, sites where multiple historical layers overlap, or where the original function of an item cannot be established with confidence. Displaying such an object would not educate. It would speculate. The Vatican avoids this deliberately. There is also an ethical dimension. Some discoveries involve sacred contexts that cannot be separated cleanly from belief. To exhibit them without full understanding would risk violating religious, cultural, or historical boundaries. Rather than turning uncertainty into spectacle, the Vatican removes the object from public circulation entirely. This does not mean the object is forgotten. It is catalogued, preserved, and revisited privately as new methods or contextual information become available. But until interpretation reaches a level of responsibility, display is postponed indefinitely. This approach stands in contrast to modern expectations of transparency and access. The Vatican accepts that this may frustrate curiosity. But it prioritizes accuracy over engagement. From its perspective, an unseen object is preferable to a misunderstood one. Public exhibition is irreversible. Once an object enters the cultural imagination, its meaning becomes fixed in ways that scholarship may later be unable to correct. By withholding certain discoveries from display, the Vatican protects both the object and the historical record. It acknowledges that not everything preserved must be seen. Some materials exist not to be witnessed, but to be safeguarded. Quietly, patiently, without pressure to perform. In doing so, the Vatican challenges a core assumption of modern culture, that visibility equals value. Within its walls, value is defined differently. Value lies in preservation without distortion. In restraint over revelation. In silence that protects meaning rather than erasing it. This is why some discoveries remain permanently absent from public view. Not because they are forbidden, but because they are not yet understood. To many outside observers, the Vatican's practices appear secretive by default. Locked rooms, restricted files, delayed releases, all seem to point toward concealment. But within the Vatican's own logic, there is a critical distinction that is often misunderstood, the difference between secrecy and restraint. Secrecy implies intent to hide. Restraint implies intent to protect. The Vatican does not deny that secrecy exists within its structure. Certain information is restricted. Certain spaces are closed. Certain materials are inaccessible. But these measures are not applied uniformly, nor are they permanent by default. What governs them is not fear of exposure, but concern for consequence. Secrecy seeks to prevent discovery. Restraint seeks to prevent misinterpretation. This distinction shapes how the Vatican approaches knowledge. When something is actively denied, it disappears from the record. When something is restrained, it remains preserved, visible internally, documented, and available for future re-evaluation. The Vatican overwhelmingly favors the second approach. Many materials that appear hidden are, in reality, carefully catalogued and tracked. Their existence is acknowledged internally. Their status is reviewed periodically. Their release is delayed, not erased. This is not the behavior of an institution trying to bury information. It is the behavior of an institution attempting to manage responsibility. History has shown the Vatican that information can be weaponized. Removed from context, a document can inflame conflict. An artifact can be used to support narratives never intended by its creators. A partial truth can do more damage than a falsehood. Restraint is the Vatican's response to this risk. It allows evidence to survive without being forced into immediate interpretation. It gives time for complementary material to surface. It allows cultural assumptions to shift. In this sense, restraint is an admission of limitation. The Vatican accepts that it does not always know how something should be understood, and that acting as if it does would be dishonest. Modern culture often treats disclosure as a moral absolute. If something exists, it should be shown. If it is known, it should be explained. The Vatican challenges this assumption. It argues that explanation carries power. And power carries responsibility. To explain something incorrectly is not neutral. It shapes belief, memory, and identity in ways that cannot easily be undone. So the Vatican draws a line. Not between truth and falsehood, but between readiness and unpreparedness. Restraint, in this framework, is not opposition to knowledge. It is stewardship of knowledge across time. This is why the Vatican is willing to tolerate criticism for being slow, closed, or conservative. It views that criticism as a lesser risk than irreversible misunderstanding. From its perspective, secrecy ends discussion. Restraint keeps discussion possible, later. And in an institution whose timeline extends far beyond a single generation, later is not avoidance. It is planning. The Vatican's relationship with knowledge stands in sharp contrast to the modern world's expectations. Today, curiosity is immediate. Questions demand instant answers. Information is expected to be accessible, searchable, and explained without delay. In this environment, silence is often interpreted as guilt and restraint is mistaken for deception. The Vatican operates according to a fundamentally different rhythm. It was formed in an age when knowledge moved slowly, when ideas took generations to settle, and when interpretation carried long-term consequences. That rhythm never disappeared. It became institutional. Modern culture values speed. The Vatican values endurance. Where contemporary institutions race to publish, the Vatican hesitates. Where modern audiences demand transparency now, the Vatican asks whether now is an appropriate moment at all. This difference creates tension. To an audience accustomed to immediate disclosure, the Vatican's patience feels obstructive. Questions arise quickly: what is being hidden? Who decides? Why not explain everything? But the Vatican does not see curiosity as neutral. Curiosity can illuminate, but it can also distort. When curiosity outpaces understanding, information becomes spectacle. Complex material is simplified. Context is stripped away. Meaning collapses into headline and rumor. The Vatican has observed this process repeatedly, especially in the modern era. Documents released without preparation are reframed through political agendas. Artifacts are reduced to symbols for debates they were never meant to address. Partial records are treated as complete truths. Once this happens, correction becomes nearly impossible. The Vatican's response is not to suppress curiosity, but to slow it. By delaying access, it creates space for scholarship, distance, and reflection. It ensures that when material is finally examined, it is approached with tools more refined than speculation. This is not a rejection of the modern world. It is a refusal to be governed by its pace. The Vatican understands that curiosity is powerful, but power without restraint is dangerous. The same lesson it applies to authority, belief, and interpretation. In a culture driven by immediacy, patience can appear suspicious. Yet from the Vatican's perspective, impatience is the greater risk. Information revealed too quickly does not deepen understanding. It accelerates misunderstanding. This is why the Vatican often seems out of step with the present. It is not trying to keep up. It is trying to outlast. By resisting the demand for instant explanation, the Vatican preserves the possibility of deeper understanding later, when curiosity is matched by context. In this sense, the Vatican positions itself not as an opponent of modern inquiry, but as a counterbalance. A reminder that not every question must be answered immediately. Not every discovery must become public spectacle. Not every silence signals wrongdoing. Sometimes, silence is a deliberate pause. Protecting meaning from being consumed before it can be understood.
There are moments in history when revealing the truth does not clarify reality, it destabilizes it. The Vatican is acutely aware of this. Across centuries, it has witnessed how information, even when accurate, can fracture belief systems, provoke violence, or harden divisions when released without the capacity for understanding. In such moments, silence is not an absence of truth. It is a protective measure. Truth, separated from context, becomes volatile. A document may be authentic, yet destructive if interpreted through fear or ideology. An artifact may be genuine, yet dangerous if it challenges identity without offering explanation. The Vatican has learned that truth does not exist in isolation. It exists within the structures that receive it. When those structures are fragile, truth can harm rather than heal. This is why the Vatican sometimes chooses silence over disclosure. Not because truth is unwelcome, but because its consequences are unpredictable. In periods of social unrest, theological uncertainty, or political instability, releasing sensitive material can accelerate collapse. History offers countless examples. Texts used to justify persecution, discoveries reframed as threats, partial evidence transformed into absolute claims. The Vatican has seen truth weaponized. Silence, in contrast, can slow reaction. It prevents immediate polarization. It allows societies to stabilize before confronting material that demands nuance. This approach is deeply counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. We often assume that truth is inherently liberating. The Vatican does not deny this, but it adds a condition. Truth liberates only when it can be understood responsibly. When understanding is absent, truth becomes pressure. Pressure leads to fear. Fear seeks simple answers. Silence interrupts that cycle. This does not mean the Vatican rejects truth. It means it treats truth as something that must be introduced carefully, with attention to timing, readiness, and consequence. In this sense, silence becomes a form of stewardship. By holding information back, the Vatican is not denying reality. It is managing its impact. This philosophy acknowledges an uncomfortable reality. Societies are not always prepared to confront certain truths. Belief systems evolve. Cultural frameworks change. What is intolerable in one era may become discussable in another. The Vatican plans for those shifts. It accepts criticism for being slow, cautious, or opaque because it measures success differently. Its goal is not immediate clarity, but long-term coherence. From its perspective, releasing truth prematurely is not courage. It is negligence. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be safer than truth, not because truth is dangerous, but because understanding takes time. And time, as the Vatican has learned, is often the difference between revelation and rupture. There are points in history when knowledge itself becomes destabilizing, not because it is false, but because it collides with structures that cannot absorb it. The Vatican has encountered such moments repeatedly. Discoveries that challenged theological assumptions, documents that complicated moral authority, evidence that did not fit comfortably within established frameworks of belief. In these moments, the danger was not the information, it was the reaction to it. Knowledge does not enter a neutral space. It enters societies shaped by fear, power, and identity. When information threatens those foundations, it is rarely received calmly. The Vatican learned early that some forms of knowledge function like stress tests. They expose fractures that already exist. A text that questions doctrine may not create doubt. It may reveal doubt that was already present. An artifact that contradicts tradition may not destroy belief. It may show how fragile belief has become. In such cases, release is not enlightenment. It is acceleration. History provides clear examples. Theological disputes that escalated into violence. Documents taken out of context and used to justify repression. Partial truths amplified into absolute claims. The Vatican observed that once knowledge enters public discourse under unstable conditions, it quickly escapes control. Interpretation becomes ideology. Ideology becomes division. Division becomes conflict. This is why the Vatican treats certain forms of knowledge as potential threats, not to faith alone, but to social cohesion. Threat does not mean danger in the abstract. It means the likelihood of harm when information is received without preparation. To mitigate this risk, the Vatican relies on delay, contextualization, and selective release. It waits for moments when societies possess the intellectual tools to engage complexity without collapsing into extremes. This approach is not about protecting authority from challenge. The Vatican has endured challenge for centuries. It is about preventing knowledge from becoming fuel. Fuel for fear, fuel for manipulation, fuel for narratives that simplify what cannot be simplified. Modern culture often assumes that more information automatically leads to better outcomes. The Vatican's experience suggests otherwise. Information amplifies what already exists. In a stable environment, it deepens understanding. In an unstable one, it magnifies fracture. The Vatican does not deny knowledge. It regulates exposure to it. By recognizing when knowledge becomes a threat, it attempts to ensure that discovery does not outrun comprehension. This is why some materials are held back not because they undermine belief, but because belief, identity, or social order may not yet be able to withstand them. The Vatican measures readiness not by curiosity, but by resilience. When resilience is lacking, silence becomes a safeguard. Because once knowledge ignites reaction faster than reflection, its consequences cannot be undone. And the Vatican, shaped by centuries of such consequences, chooses caution, not as fear, but as responsibility. Every long-lasting institution faces moments that threaten its legitimacy. Scandals, internal conflict. There are moments in history when revealing the truth does not clarify reality. It destabilizes it. The Vatican is acutely aware of this. Across centuries, it has witnessed how information, even when accurate, can fracture belief systems, provoke violence, or harden divisions when released without the capacity for understanding. In such moments, silence is not an absence of truth. It is a protective measure. Truth, separated from context, becomes volatile. A document may be authentic, yet destructive if interpreted through fear or ideology. An artifact may be genuine, yet dangerous if it challenges identity without offering explanation. The Vatican has learned that truth does not exist in isolation. It exists within the structures that receive it. When those structures are fragile, truth can harm rather than heal. This is why the Vatican sometimes chooses silence over disclosure. Not because truth is unwelcome, but because its consequences are unpredictable. In periods of social unrest, theological uncertainty, or political instability, releasing sensitive material can accelerate collapse. History offers countless examples. Texts used to justify persecution, discoveries reframed as threats, partial evidence transformed into absolute claims. The Vatican has seen truth weaponized. Silence, in contrast, can slow reaction. It prevents immediate polarization. It allows societies to stabilize before confronting material that demands nuance. This approach is deeply counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. We often assume that truth is inherently liberating. The Vatican does not deny this, but it adds a condition. Truth liberates only when it can be understood responsibly. When understanding is absent, truth becomes pressure. Pressure leads to fear. Fear seeks simple answers. Silence interrupts that cycle. This does not mean the Vatican rejects truth. It means it treats truth as something that must be introduced carefully, with attention to timing, readiness, and consequence. In this sense, silence becomes a form of stewardship. By holding information back, The Vatican is not denying reality. It is managing its impact. This philosophy acknowledges an uncomfortable reality. Societies are not always prepared to confront certain truths. Belief systems evolve. Cultural frameworks change. What is intolerable in one era may become discussable in another. The Vatican plans for those shifts. It accepts criticism for being slow, cautious, or opaque because it measures success differently. Its goal is not immediate clarity, but long-term coherence. From its perspective, releasing truth prematurely is not courage. It is negligence. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be safer than truth, not because truth is dangerous, but because understanding takes time. And time, as the Vatican has learned, is often the difference between revelation and rupture. There are points in history when knowledge itself becomes destabilizing, not because it is false, but because it collides with structures that cannot absorb it. The Vatican has encountered such moments repeatedly. Discoveries that challenged theological assumptions, documents that complicated moral authority, evidence that did not fit comfortably within established frameworks of belief. In these moments, the danger was not the information, it was the reaction to it. Knowledge does not enter a neutral space. It enters societies shaped by fear, power, and identity. When information threatens those foundations, it is rarely received calmly. The Vatican learned early that some forms of knowledge function like stress tests. They expose fractures that already exist. A text that questions doctrine may not create doubt. It may reveal doubt that was already present. An artifact that contradicts tradition may not destroy belief. It may show how fragile belief has become. In such cases, release is not enlightenment. It is acceleration. History provides clear examples. Theological disputes that escalated into violence. Documents taken out of context and used to justify repression. Partial truths amplified into absolute claims. The Vatican observed that once knowledge enters public discourse under unstable conditions, it quickly escapes control. Interpretation becomes ideology. Ideology becomes division. Division becomes conflict. This is why the Vatican treats certain forms of knowledge as potential threats, not to faith alone, but to social cohesion. Threat does not mean danger in the abstract. It means the likelihood of harm when information is received without preparation. To mitigate this risk, the Vatican relies on delay, contextualization, and selective release. It waits for moments when societies possess the intellectual tools to engage complexity without collapsing into extremes. This approach is not about protecting authority from challenge. The Vatican has endured challenge for centuries. It is about preventing knowledge from becoming fuel. Fuel for fear, fuel for manipulation, fuel for narratives that simplify what cannot be simplified. Modern culture often assumes that more information automatically leads to better outcomes. The Vatican's experience suggests otherwise. Information amplifies what already exists. In a stable environment, it deepens understanding. In an unstable one, it magnifies fracture. The Vatican does not deny knowledge. It regulates exposure to it. By recognizing when knowledge becomes a threat, it attempts to ensure that discovery does not outrun comprehension. This is why some materials are held back not because they undermine belief, but because belief, identity, or social order may not yet be able to withstand them. The Vatican measures readiness not by curiosity, but by resilience. When resilience is lacking, silence becomes a safeguard. Because once knowledge ignites reaction faster than reflection, its consequences cannot be undone. And the Vatican, shaped by centuries of such consequences, chooses caution, not as fear, but as responsibility. Every long-lasting institution faces moments that threaten its legitimacy. Scandals, internal conflict, despite its reputation for silence. The Vatican does release a significant amount of material to the public. This fact is often overlooked. Papal correspondence from previous centuries is open to scholars. Diplomatic records are gradually declassified. Internal debates, once considered sensitive, are made available after time has passed. The Vatican does not oppose disclosure as a principle. It practices time disclosure. What distinguishes the material that is released from what remains restricted is not controversy, but readiness. Documents are opened when their historical context is sufficiently complete, when the individuals involved are no longer subject to retaliation or misrepresentation, when related records can be examined together rather than in isolation. The Vatican prefers release in context, not in fragments. This is why large archival openings often occur in waves. Entire periods are made accessible at once, allowing scholars to reconstruct events holistically rather than through selective excerpts. Partial truth is more dangerous than silence. The Vatican has learned that isolated documents invite sensationalism. Released alongside complementary materials, the same documents invite analysis. This policy reflects a belief that understanding requires proportion. When the Vatican opens its archives, it does so with an expectation of rigor. Access is typically granted to trained historians, linguists, and researchers capable of working with primary sources critically. This is not elitism, it is precaution. The Vatican recognizes that raw historical material is powerful. Without methodological discipline, it can be misunderstood or exploited. This is why public exhibitions, publications, and digitization projects are carefully curated. Released material is framed with explanatory scholarship, not dramatic emphasis. The goal is not to shock, but to inform. In recent decades, the Vatican has expanded access significantly. Millions of pages have been cataloged, restored, and digitized. Entire eras once inaccessible are now open to research. These releases often challenge simplified narratives about the Church's past, sometimes in its favor, sometimes not. The Vatican accepts this outcome. It does not release material to defend itself. It releases material because it believes history should eventually be examined honestly. But honesty, in its view, requires preparation. What the Vatican is willing to release is material that can stand on its own without destabilizing interpretation. Material that contributes to understanding rather than speculation. This selective openness reveals an important truth. Silence is not permanent by default. It is conditional. The Vatican does not ask whether something should be known. It asks when it can be known responsibly. And when that moment arrives, the material is not hidden. It is handed over, carefully, deliberately, and with the expectation that it will be studied rather than consumed. Not everything the Vatican safeguards is intended for eventual explanation. Some materials are preserved without any expectation of resolution. This distinction is subtle, but critical. There are documents, objects, and records within the Vatican that are not awaiting declassification or reinterpretation. They are preserved because they exist, not because they promise clarity. In these cases, the Vatican's role shifts from mediator of knowledge to guardian of evidence. Such materials often sit at the edge of comprehension. They do not contradict doctrine directly, nor do they support it. They do not fit neatly into political or historical narratives. Their significance is ambiguous and may remain so indefinitely. The Vatican does not attempt to force coherence onto these materials. To do so would be to impose meaning where none can be responsibly established. Instead, they are preserved as they are, incomplete, unresolved, and resistant to explanation. This approach reflects an acceptance of historical limits. Not every event leaves a clear record. Not every artifact carries an interpretable function. Not every testimony leads to understanding. The Vatican acknowledges this reality openly within its internal philosophy. Preservation, in these cases, is an act of humility. By choosing not to explain, the Vatican admits that some aspects of the past exceed the capacity of current knowledge. It resists the temptation to fill gaps with narrative convenience. Modern institutions often treat uncertainty as a problem to be solved. The Vatican treats it as a condition to be respected. Some materials are preserved precisely because they challenge interpretation. They remind future scholars that history is not always coherent, linear, or complete. To explain them prematurely would diminish their value. These preserved uncertainties serve another purpose as well. They act as safeguards against revisionism. When history is too neatly explained, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Ambiguity, when preserved honestly, resists simplification. The Vatican understands that explanation is reversible, but preservation is not. An explanation can be corrected. A destroyed object cannot be recovered. So when forced to choose, the Vatican consistently prioritizes preservation over clarity. This does not mean it abandons the pursuit of understanding. It means it separates understanding from urgency. Some materials may one day be interpreted. Others may never be. The Vatican accepts both outcomes. Its responsibility, as it sees it, is not to resolve every question, but to ensure that the question survives intact. By preserving without explaining, the Vatican keeps history open, not frozen in certainty, but alive with possibility. And in a world that demands constant answers, this quiet refusal to conclude may be one of its most deliberate choices. The Vatican's long-term approach to preservation is shaped by a simple assumption. The future will not think like the present. Every generation believes it possesses a clearer understanding of history than those before it. And every generation is later proven wrong, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it lacked distance. The Vatican plans for that distance. By preserving materials without forcing interpretation, it allows future historians to approach the past without being bound by the conclusions of earlier eras. What seems unresolved today may appear obvious tomorrow. What feels controversial now may later be contextualized as inevitable. This is why the Vatican resists finality. Interpretations are products of their time. They reflect prevailing moral frameworks, technological limitations, and cultural assumptions. To lock an interpretation into the historical record is to anchor meaning to a moment that will eventually pass. Future historians will possess tools that do not yet exist. Analytical methods, linguistic models, forensic techniques, and comparative databases will continue to evolve. Questions that cannot be answered today may become straightforward later. The Vatican anticipates this. It does not assume that current scholarship represents the peak of understanding. It assumes the opposite. This humility informs its archival philosophy. Materials are preserved so they can be re-examined under future conditions, free from the pressure of present-day conclusions. What is preserved intact can be reinterpreted. What is explained prematurely cannot. The Vatican also understands that future historians will bring different priorities. They will ask different questions. They will be less invested in defending or challenging the assumptions of the present. Distance creates neutrality. By withholding interpretation, the Vatican prevents its own authority from shaping future inquiry too strongly. It allows history to remain open to reinterpretation rather than locked into institutional narratives. This does not guarantee that future interpretations will be correct. It guarantees only that they will be possible. The Vatican accepts this uncertainty. From its perspective, the role of an archive is not to answer history's questions once and for all. It is to ensure that history remains available to be questioned. Future historians may discover patterns invisible today. They may connect materials that currently appear unrelated. They may reinterpret silence itself as meaningful evidence. By preserving without explanation, the Vatican ensures that such reinterpretation remains viable. In this sense, the Vatican is not archiving for the present. It is archiving for readers who do not yet exist. Readers who will judge the past differently. Readers who will understand context we cannot imagine. Readers who will see continuity where we see contradiction. The Vatican prepares for them by resisting closure. Because history, in its deepest sense, is never finished. It only waits for those capable of seeing it anew. History is often presented as something complete, a sequence of events, a chain of causes and outcomes, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Vatican does not accept this model. From its perspective, history is never finished. It is not a closed record, but an open accumulation of memory, interpretation, and absence. Every archive, no matter how extensive, contains gaps. Documents that were never written, voices that were never recorded, decisions that were made without explanation, events that left no trace. The Vatican does not attempt to correct this incompleteness. It preserves it. Within its collections, absence is treated as part of the record. A missing document is not always a failure of preservation. Sometimes it is evidence of how power operated, how silence was imposed, or how events escaped documentation altogether. To pretend otherwise would be dishonest. This is why the Vatican resists definitive historical narratives. Any attempt to present history as complete requires smoothing over uncertainty, erasing contradiction, and inventing coherence where none existed. The Vatican chooses not to do this. It accepts that history is fragmentary by nature. Some questions will never be answered. Some motives will never be known. Some events will remain ambiguous forever. Rather than viewing this as a weakness, the Vatican treats it as a reality to be respected. This approach stands in contrast to modern expectations, which often demand closure. We want answers. We want conclusions. We want to believe that the past can be fully understood. The Vatican suggests otherwise. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by what was preserved, but by what was lost. Not only by what was said, but by what was withheld. Not only by presence, but by absence. By preserving materials without forcing resolution, the Vatican allows this incompleteness to remain visible. In doing so, it resists the temptation to transform history into myth. Myth simplifies. History complicates. The Vatican chooses complication. It preserves uncertainty as a safeguard against false certainty. It allows unanswered questions to remain part of the historical landscape, rather than smoothing them into comforting explanations. This philosophy acknowledges a difficult truth. Full understanding may be impossible, but incomplete understanding is still worth preserving. By maintaining the unfinished nature of history, the Vatican ensures that future generations encounter the past not as a closed book, but as an ongoing inquiry. An inquiry that invites humility. An inquiry that resists final answers. An inquiry that remains alive precisely because it is unresolved. History, in this view, is not something we master. It is something we inherit. Incomplete, complex, and still unfolding. When people speak about the Vatican silence, they often imagine secrecy as an act of concealment, a decision to hide, a refusal to share, an effort to control what others are allowed to know. But after moving through its archives, sealed rooms, unresolved objects, and preserved uncertainties, a different picture emerges. Silence, in the Vatican's philosophy, is not absence. It is presence without conclusion. The Vatican does not treat silence as a void. It treats it as a container, a space where evidence can exist without being distorted by premature explanation. This is why so much within the Vatican remains untouched by narrative. Documents are preserved without commentary. Objects are stored without labels. Events are recorded without resolution. Not because answers are forbidden, but because answers carry consequences. Once something is explained, it becomes fixed. Once it is fixed, it becomes defended. Once it is defended, it stops being questioned. The Vatican understands that certainty is seductive but dangerous. It simplifies what should remain complex. It turns memory into doctrine and inquiry into belief. Silence resists that transformation. By refusing to explain everything, the Vatican keeps history flexible. It allows evidence to outlive interpretation. It ensures that future generations can approach the past without being bound by the conclusions of those who came before. This approach is deeply uncomfortable for a modern world that equates transparency with virtue and immediacy with honesty. But the Vatican measures honesty differently. For it, honesty lies in acknowledging limits. Limits of knowledge, limits of context, limits of interpretation. The Vatican does not claim to understand everything it preserves. It claims only to protect it from loss. In doing so, it accepts a burden few institutions are willing to carry, the burden of not knowing. Silence becomes an admission of humility. It says, "This exists, but we do not yet understand it well enough to explain it responsibly." It says, "The past is not ours to resolve completely. It belongs to the future as much as to the present." This is why the Vatican feels timeless. It is not racing toward revelation. It is not performing certainty. It is not trying to satisfy curiosity. It is waiting for better questions, waiting for stronger methods, waiting for a world capable of holding complexity without reducing it to spectacle. In the end, the Vatican silence is not about power. It is about patience, a belief that history should be carried forward intact, incomplete, unresolved, and resistant to simplification. Because once something is destroyed, it is gone forever. But when something is preserved in silence, it remains possible. And in the Vatican's philosophy, possibility is more valuable than conclusion.